Hey there, everyone. Welcome. My name is Chef Lauren, and I'm so excited to host today's session. On the tail of some great events for Women's History Month, ISS Guggenheimer launched a new diversity series, Lead, Grow, Deepen. The goal of this series is to help us become an organization that leads with inclusion and grows in our diversity so that we can deepen our partnership with our clients and the community. Adrian Miller is a culinary historian, lawyer, and public policy advisor. He is the author of Soul Food, which won the 2014 James Beard Foundation Book Award for Reference and Scholarship, and the President's Kitchen Cabinet, which was nominated for a 2018 NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literary Work. He also served as White House advisor to U.S. President Bill Clinton. Adrian's latest book, Black Smoke, was just released last month, just in time for us to celebrate National Barbecue Month together. I'm so thrilled to introduce you to the Prince of the Pit, the Lord of the Greens, the Baron of Barbecue, and the Czar of Char, Adrian Miller. Welcome, Adrian.
That's great. Those are good hype names. You got a future.
Hey, you know what? We're friends now, right? This is our third event together. So can I call you my friend?
Oh yeah, you can.
So, okay, I got to tell you, as friends, I'm super jealous of you. You have followers that you asked to come up with these hype names. Is that right?
That's right.
And how many did you get?
A lot of good ones.
Wow. Okay. Well, everyone, I'm so excited that you're joining us for this event. Throughout this event, please use that chat box off to the right side to share your thoughts and questions with Adrian. We have 16 signed copies of Adrian's brand new book that we are going to raffle off to those of you in the audience who ask questions today. So please make sure you take advantage of this great opportunity. I just started reading this and I cannot get enough. So make sure that you head over to that chat box throughout this event. Please share your thoughts, share your questions with us over there. All right, Adrian, are you ready to get started?
I am.
All right.
So good to be with you. So thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. Of course. And it's our third event together. It's good to have you back. All right. So to kick us off, can you just tell us a little bit about your first book, Soul Food?
Yeah, so Soul Food is really the story of one aspect of African-American cuisine, because unfortunately, soul food's become shorthand for all African-American cooking. And so the idea here was to take a representative soul food meal, explain what goes in the meal, how it got there and what it means for the culture. And then I include recipes. So, traditional recipes, health conscious recipes, and then fancy ones in case you want to show off as a cook. So let me just quickly go through the meal. And for those of you who are watching, you can put in the comments, you can applaud, you can say amen, whatever makes you feel good. And then also I have my social media here. So I'm Soul Food Scholar on most platforms. So give a brother some love online. Unless you have something negative to say, then you can just hold on to that, right? There's no reason to share that. So here's the meal. Entrees, fried chicken, catfish, or chitlins. And if you don't know what chitlins are pig intestines. Not for everybody, either stewed or fried. And then you've got as side dishes, greens. And in soul food, the popular greens are collard, kale, mustard, and turnip, and cabbage. So if you've discovered kale in the last 5 to 10 years, welcome to the party, because we've been eating them for about 300. And then you've got black-eyed peas, candy jams, which are sweet potatoes, and macaroni and cheese. Then I wrote a chapter on cornbread. I wrote a chapter about hot sauce. Then I also wrote a chapter about red drink, because in soul food culture, red is a color and a flavor. And I believe that red Kool-Aid is the official soul food drink. Now, there are a lot of youngins that seem to like purple and blue. And as I write in my book, I do believe the children are our future, that we should teach them well and let them lead the way, but not on Kool-Aid because they're messing it up. And then for dessert, I wrote about 4 desserts: peach cobbler, pound cake, banana pudding, and sweet potato pie. So that's the typical meal. And so fortunately, I was lucky enough to win the James Beard Award for that book in 2014. So it was cool.
Wow. Wow. So there is a perception out there about soul food being slave food. What's your take on that? And can you give us a little bit of background?
Sure. So if we can go to the next slide. What's important to see here, this is a graphic representation of the movement of enslaved people from Africa to the Americas. And so what you're seeing here is that most people of African heritage in the United States, we trace our heritage to the western coast of Africa, basically from Senegal all the way down to Angola. And 10 million to 25 million people, we don't know for sure because we don't have accurate records of that, went across the Atlantic in something called the Middle Passage. And that journey was anywhere from 10 to 12 weeks, depending on where you left in the old world and where you showed up in the Americas. And so what this shows you is that most people that come across the ocean went to points south of what would eventually become the United States. Only 4% show up here. So the typical, what I argue is that soul food is really a European meal with West African influences. But if you eat with someone from African heritage, any point south of the United States, you're typically going to have an African meal with Western European influences because of similarities in climate, and then more autonomy over their food sources. Now let's go. So that's just showing you the movement of people. Now, if we go to the next slide. So I think the reason why people think soul food is slave food, because one of the narratives about soul food is that, hey, African Americans took the very worst things that were thrown at them during slavery and figured out a way to make it delicious. And that's a very empowering narrative, and part of that is the story. But I want to show you this schematic of a plantation. So this was a plantation outside of Charleston, South Carolina. And so that wide mill space that's open was the pasture. So beyond that is where the commodity crop would be grown. But in the middle there's some numbers that are upside down. Those are essentially the dwellings where the enslaved lived. And then below that, it says Negro gardens. So there were plots of land and poultry ground. So the point I want to get across to people is that even though there were rationed amounts of food that were given out every week, and those rations could be 5 pounds of some starch, it could be cornmeal, rice, or sweet potatoes, a couple of pounds of smoked meat, usually pork, but it could be beef or fish, whatever was cheapest, and then a jug of molasses. So the enslaved had to figure out how to subsist by hunting, foraging, gardening, raising their own livestock. All of these things went into play. So this plantation shows you that there were instances where the enslaved actually had autonomy over their food sources. So they could grow their own vegetables, they could raise their own animals. And in some cases, people were pretty good at growing their own food, and they were allowed to go to a nearby town and go to the market on the weekend and sell the extra produce or any lost livestock that they wanted to sell. And we have examples of enslaved people actually buying their freedom. But the typical day was you got up in the morning at dawn, you ate usually from a trough, and that trough was filled with crumbled up cornbread and buttermilk. And people had to either eat with their fingers or a seafood shell because a knife or a fork was a potential weapon. And so slaveholders did not want the enslaved to have that. And then you would go out and work, and then you'd come back, and then in the middle of the day was usually out of that same trough that had been washed out were essentially boiled vegetables. Maybe there was a little meat in there to season the vegetables. And then you came back at the end of the day after sundown and had supper. And supper was usually leftovers from the midday meal. So that's typically what it was. So day in and day out, most of the enslaved people were eating very close to what we call vegan today. It was really only on the weekends and special occasions when the work schedule slowed that people had time to make things like the glorious fried chicken or cakes, desserts, or barbecue. So the story of the food of African Americans is just a little more complicated than what people usually hear.
So a lot more than just slave food, right? Yeah. I think really, as you said, it was that autonomy of going out and foraging and, making your basic meals, but then having those like other special treats for yourselves that you could enjoy as well.
Absolutely. And then the enslaved also borrowed from the slaveholders, right? So you have a lot of high-end British cooking that enters what we would later call soul food. So for instance, sweet potato pie. Henry VIII was grubbing on sweet potato tartlets centuries before. Macaroni and cheese, that was royalty food going all the way back to the 1300s. So there's a mix of all kinds of cultures that go into soul food. So I want people to understand soul food's complexity.
Okay, and to make things even more complex, usually people would say, oh, soul food is just like super unhealthy, right? It's more that like comfort food, unhealthy food. Is that true? You said vegan, so.
Yeah. We can go to the next slide. So one thing I forgot to mention is like soul food really takes shape when millions of African Americans leave the South for other parts of the country. And when you get to the new place, they did what any other migrant group does. You try to recreate home. And if you can do it with the exact same stuff you had back at home, you do that. But often you're borrowing from other cultures. And that's where soul food takes shape. So now let's go to the next slide. So that part of it is true because people are focusing on the celebration aspect of the cuisine. So, the stuff like fried chicken and, that's not going to be good for you to eat day in and day out. Even though it sounds like a good idea, it's not good for your body. So there are a lot of trends right now in soul food. So one of them is down home healthy. And the idea is to take traditional soul food, the celebration stuff, and make it healthier by reducing the salt, the sugar, and the fat. And so this is an example from my book. This is a Creole broiled catfish. So instead of frying the catfish fillet, what you do is you just rub olive oil on it and then put on your favorite Creole seasoning and then broil it for about 7 minutes till it's just opaque and serve it up. This is one of the most popular recipes from my book. And if I can just give a public service announcement, this is a recipe from an ex-girlfriend. So just offer a pro tip. If you are dating someone who's a very good cook or married to someone who's a very good cook, do what you can to stay with that person. But if you notice that things are getting rocky, I can tell you from personal experience, it's a lot easier to get the recipes before you break up. All right, next slide.
I can't imagine why that would be, Adrian.
And then, so another trend is upscale soul food. So that's doubling down on the extravagant aspects of soul food. So, heirloom vegetables, heritage meat, a real emphasis on presentation. Next slide. But the strongest trend right now is vegan. So this is a place called Solely Vegan in Oakland, California. And I went to this place as I ate my way through the country to do research. And so going from left to right, you've got Southern fried tofu, vegan mac and cheese, vegan collard greens with a cayenne pepper lemonade. So that tofu was shaped to look like fried chicken, but it reminded me more of catfish. The vegan mac and cheese was made with almond milk. So it wasn't creamy, right? Because you don't have cream in vegan cuisine. But it did remind me of stuffed tortellini in terms of texture and kind of taste. The collard greens were as good as any because if you know how to season vegetables, you can do it in a way where you don't even miss the meat. And so this is where you're seeing most of the creativity. And then if we can go to the next slide, collard green quesadillas and soul rolls. These are examples of fusion. So you're seeing people playing around with soul food categories and mixing in others. So for instance, with the collard green quesadilla, that's from a place called the Blaxican in Atlanta. That's his name, not mine. Don't get mad at me. But he's doing things like collard green quesadilla and then soul food filled egg rolls you see all over the place. So that's just taking an egg roll wrapper and putting in like mac and cheese. This one is chicken, rice, and gravy, collard greens, sometimes a combination of all of those things. So those are the current trends. So I tell people soul food is not inherently unhealthy. It's how you present it. And the other thing to think about is what are nutritionists telling us to eat? They're telling us to eat more dark leafy greens, more sweet potatoes, more fish. A lot of these things are the building blocks of soul food.
And I think that's great news for all of us chefs, right? Because I think that all the dishes that you just mentioned are things that all of our users and our clients, they really want to eat, but you're saying that there are definitely ways, there's space on our menus for these items, and we can kind of elevate them and look at, which cooking techniques are we using? What's our portion size looking like? So we can still offer these elements, but not necessarily have to have them, like fried chicken every day, but we can have different elements that represent soul food still.
Absolutely.
Yum, 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 yum. All right. So soul food, Christine said, now I'm hungry. We just need you to help us build that hunger to get ready for lunch. I want to talk a little bit about the President's Kitchen Cabinet, though. Can you give us an overview of your second book, and then we can dive into that?
Yeah, so the President's Kitchen Cabinet came out of the research for soul food because I came across these stories of African Americans who had cooked for our presidents. And, it was like, duh, of course, because we had so many slaveholding presidents. In DC, I don't know if people think of it this way, but it's very much like a Southern town. And it was carved out of 2 slave states. So you had you had a very strong African-American presence in the White House. So I wanted to just write a collective biography and tell the story of the enslaved people, the free people, and also the people who encountered presidents away from the White House and talk about what contributions they made to our national cuisine. Now, that is a picture of me in the White House kitchen, which is very small. It's only 26 by 32 feet. And the gentleman I'm with is named Adam Collick. So he's what's called a kitchen steward. So he's been in the White House kitchen since the Reagan administration. Wow. And he's an amateur bodybuilder as well. So very impressive guy. But he helps make sure that all the equipment in the White House kitchen is working. And then he also helps out with the cooking. But the current executive chef in the White House is a Filipina named Cristeta Comerford. And she's been there since the second term of George W. Bush. So that's a pretty lengthy stint And she's covered, basically 4 administrations now. So it's interesting.
Wow. Okay. So if I wanted to work in the White House, what's my path like? How do I get there?
So pretty much you have to know somebody. Most of the hires, so usually the people on staff will alert someone when there's a job announcement for the White House kitchen. But in recent years, and I'm not saying everybody, but a lot of people pretty much have gone through the boutique hotel career path. So that's one strong way to get to the White House. Another way to get there is through military service. So the White House is staffed by a lot of Navy cooks. So if you're a really good Navy cook and you excel, you can get a White House assignment. So those are primarily the 2 paths. The other way is if you just know the president. Because the thing about being a White House chef, if the president likes your food, that person can name you the White House executive chef. There's no qualification on that.
I assume that, that path is a little bit different than the path that people would have had to take a little bit earlier in president cooks and stuff like that. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, what that path would have been like?
Sure. Let's go to the next slide. So here's a look at the White House domestic staff. And this was taken in spring of 1877. And it's all African-American. And the president at that time, if we had more time, I would have done a pop quiz asking someone to name who was president in 1877. And as I sat here in silence waiting, I would just say, okay, Rutherford B. Hayes. I'm sure that was on the tip of your tongue. But most of the early presidents had to pay for their own residential staff. And so they brought their servants with them. And a lot of times they brought enslaved people with them if they were a slaveholder. So that was the path to the White House. If we go to the next slide, when we get to a more modern White House with the Kennedys and so on, what we find is that there's more of a free labor market. And then it just really matters what the taste is traditionally of the first lady in terms of food. So Jacqueline Kennedy wanted more elevated White House cooking. And so she started hiring classically trained chefs, usually white men, to do the cooking in the White House. So that's where we start to see the waning of the influence of African Americans. So it was, but the White House kitchen has been multicultural and multiracial since its earliest days, because we've had enslaved African Americans, free African Americans, free whites, and indentured whites, and later then Filipinos, all working side by side.
Wow. And I mean, the White House can't be all business all the time, right? Like, what happens if a president wants to just let loose, have a cocktail or 2 or 3? What's going down?
So they want to do, if the president wants to get their drink on, of course they can, but they try to keep it under wraps, because one of the longest running cat and mouse games in White House history has been keeping the public from knowing that the president wants to get their drink on. And so to the extent that information gets leaked out, usually it's just the president likes to have a glass of wine. What really gets a president in trouble is when they start doing cocktails. I mean, most of the headaches for presidents have been centered around cocktails. And the Kennedys got a lot of grief for having cocktails before dinner at the White House. So they kind of put that under wraps.
Wow. Okay. So they keep it on the DL, but fun definitely is happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And we know a little bit about this because we've had White House staffers write memoirs that kind of leaked some juicy stuff. So without going into details, whenever and speaking of the Kennedy connection, whenever President Kennedy asked for daiquiris and Vienna sausages, the staff knew that something freaky was about to go down in the White House swimming pool. Yeah, I'll just leave it with that.
Okay, all right. But we're going to go ahead and move on now. Kennedys, hey. So Adrian, tell me, who was the last African-American to be offered the White House executive chef role?
Yeah, let's go to the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. So this is an example. I forgot to mention, Hercules was the enslaved cook for George Washington. So this is an example of an enslaved cook being the presidential cook eventually. One thing to mention is, for a long time, we thought this was a portrait of Hercules. This is hanging in a museum in Spain. But some art historians have figured out that it actually isn't him and wasn't attributed to the artist they thought, who was associated with a lot of famous George Washington paintings. Now, I wish they had figured this out before I put the brother on my cover, on my book cover and in my book, but you have to go with things as they exist in the time. So next slide, though. So Patrick Clark was really the last person to be offered the White House chef job, and this was during the Clinton administration. So Patrick Clark was a notable chef in the New York scene, especially during the 1980s, was associated with some very top-notch restaurants. And Anthony Bourdain, who does not suffer fools, praised him in his book, Kitchen Confidential. So, this guy had game. So he was working in a hotel across from the White House when the Clintons came into the White House, and they started sending people over to just check out his food, and they loved what he was cooking. So they offered him the job, but he turned it down because he was making far more money at the hotel than he would ever make at the White House. So at the time that he was offered the job, he was making six figures at the hotel. The White House executive chef job was $58,000 a year. So he had 4 kids to feed, and he's like, nah, I can't do that. But in 1994, the Clintons circled back to him, and they asked him to prepare the state dinner for President Nelson Mandela of South Africa. And so he accepts that, and he ends up cooking the meal. I have the recipes in my book. So the meal was a sesame wasabi crusted halibut with red curry and lemongrass vegetables. And the idea, ever since the Clintons, it's really been the MO for state dinners. The idea is to take American ingredients and then create a flavor profile that's a nod to the visiting dignitary. And so, so that's the meal that was made. And shortly before the dinner, like a couple days before the dinner happened, the Clintons said, Chef Clark, you're not going to make this meal. He said, what? I've been doing all this planning there? They said, no, we want you to be a guest of honor. And so he actually was sitting at the table with Nelson Mandela. Unfortunately, Chef Clark died in the late 90s of congestive heart failure in his early 40s. And so we lost a leading culinary light. But he's the last one to be offered that job. Now, this doesn't preclude anybody else, because like I said, the president can pick anybody to be their chef.
Is that common, though? Was that common to have, like your chef or kitchen staff come and join the guests, or was that like an anomaly?
That was definitely an anomaly. Definitely.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Wow. Do you, any thoughts from President Nelson Mandela on how he liked the meal?
He was a gracious man, so I'm sure he liked it. I couldn't find any public comments, but there was no shade thrown at the meal in the press afterwards. So I'm thinking he dug it.
All right. Well, thank you for a little bit of insight. It's always so fascinating to learn. There's a lot of chefs on this call right now, and I don't know, I could never picture myself, like cooking for the president. So that's pretty extreme. That's pretty extreme. All right. Shall we move on to Black Smoke then? Right?
Yeah, let's do it.
I've got a copy of Black Smoke here. I was talking to you on Monday about the introduction and how I literally reading the words in here, I like spit out my drink because I was laughing so hard. Tell us a little bit about Black Smoke.
Sure. So Black Smoke is really a celebration of African-American barbecue culture, and it's part celebration and part restoration. So the restoration part is, if you pay attention to food media, especially about barbecue, you'll probably notice that you don't see a lot of African-Americans. And that's just crazy to me, because barbecue was a huge part of my own culinary tradition. And then also, I know that African-Americans made significant contributions to this very popular food. So if we can go to the next slide. By the time you get to the 1800s, African-Americans are strongly associated with barbecue. So let's zoom in here. So this is what barbecue was for 200 years. It was essentially digging a trench, filling that trench with hardwood burning coals, and often there would be somebody manning a separate fire. And then you get whole animals, you would butterfly them, stick poles in the side, and then people had to flip them periodically so they didn't burn, and also sauce them. And the early sauce was pretty much red pepper and vinegar. And so the racial dynamics of our country, if anybody had to do a whole bunch of work and you didn't want to pay them, you had African Americans do it. And so essentially, by the time you get to the 19th century, so the early 1800s, African Americans and barbecue are wedded together in the public imagination. In fact, I came across a newspaper article from 1839 where a Virginian is telling a northern guy in Maine what a legitimate Southern barbecue is. And he says, first of all, you have to find a Negro man who has a reputation and skill for this and his assistants, and that's what you do to start. So basically, African Americans were key to the process. All right. So this was from an exposition in Atlanta in 1895. this not only was this image widely shared across the country, but it was written about extensively. So a lot of people got a flavor for what happened at this event. Now let's go to the next thing. So we go from that to this, and if we can zoom in, this is from Bon Appetit, July 2003. This was a list of who's who in barbecue. And look very closely and tell me, this is kind of like, well, remember Where's Waldo? All right, this is the opposite, because I'm gonna say, where's the brother or the sister? You don't see any African Americans, right? There's a Asian American and kind of in the middle with the beach ball. We've got a woman on the side there, but otherwise it's just a bunch of white dudes. And this is what food media has become. So if we go to the next slide, so the question is, how do we go from that to this? And the main argument in my book, if we go to the next slide, is that barbecue has fallen deeply in love with white dudes who barbecue. And the reason why is because of foodies. By the time you get to the late 80s, early 90s, we have a group of kind of people who are middle class, very interested in food, much more adventuresome in their palates than, say, their parents' generation. And they're really interested in barbecue. And so we've always had people who were interested in food and viewed it as leisure, but those people tended to be very wealthy. So if you go back and look at, say, Gourmet Magazine, Bon Appetit in the early years, you would find that a lot of the coverage was aimed towards high-end folks. But now with this group of foodies who have disposable income and they're willing to travel, you see a commensurate rise in food media. And so barbecue is getting immensely popular at this time. And the people who decided what stories got told about barbecue were either uninterested in diversity or they weren't diverse themselves. And so they would just talk to other white people about who should they highlight, who should they give some shine, that kind of thing. And so they just kept so all the people who were conferred with expertise were white dudes. And so at the very time that foodies are asking two questions, hey, what's barbecue and where do I get the good stuff? They get reference to these white dudes. And so I argue that there's four archetypal kind of white dudes who barbecue represented in these pictures. So on the far left, you've got Tuffy Stone, very decorated world champion barbecuer. So you got the competition guy. Then you've got Myron Mixon, who's a hybrid because he's a competition guy, but he represents kind of the Bubba, right? The working class guy from the rural America, especially rural South. And then you've got Aaron Franklin, who I argue is the most recognizable barbecue figure in the world. He's the owner of Franklin Barbecue in Austin, Texas. It's the place where people line up and stand for 4 hours in order to get some of his barbecue. But he's the urban hipster type, right? Interesting facial hair, glasses, maybe he has some tattoos. And then you've got the tokes who smoke. So you've got fine dining chefs who are in barbecue in a way that they've never been before. And I think Bobby Flay represents that the most because the Food Network made a very conscious push to establish him as a barbecue expert. And so these are the people who are, presented as the barbecue experts, and African Americans aren't. And this all came together for me in, I think it was like 2006, 2004 or 6, if you go to the next slide. So I know that I'm writing this book on barbecue, and I decided to learn more on soul food. And I decided to learn more about barbecue because so many soul food restaurants have a barbecue option on the menu. And then so many Black-owned barbecue joints have soul food side dishes. So I thought there was enough synergy. I needed to know more about barbecue. So I see this commercial on TV for Paula Deen's Southern Barbecue. And I thought, okay, this is going to be a nice survey. I'll just see who the leading figures are at this point. And then an hour later, my mouth is agape as the credits roll because no African Americans were featured in that show. And so the first question I asked myself was, well, dang, how does that even happen? And then the second, and this is the thing that made you laugh, I thought, well, maybe I got it twisted. Maybe I didn't pay close enough attention to the promotion. And it was actually Paula Deen's Scandinavian barbecue sponsored by Alabama White Sauce. Maybe I just got it twisted. So that prompted me to start looking at other barbecue media. And as I started looking around, it was just endemic. I just didn't see any African Americans. And so I said, this is not right. And I can't believe I have to write this, but I'm going to have to write a book that just restores African Americans' prominence in barbecue. And so that's what I ended up doing.
Wow. I was going
You
to
know,
ask.
in just a second, somebody's coming in the office, so I'm just going to have to close the door.
Okay, yeah, no worries. So in a little bit, we're going to switch over to a Q&A portion. So if you have been, listening and you have some questions for Adrian, feel free to pop them into the chat box. But Adrian, just coming off of what you just said, I'm not African American. Can I make good, authentic barbecue or soul food? Can I cook beyond my culture and still have it be good?
Yeah, so I may be in the minority opinion about this, but I think anyone can cook from anyone else's culture as long as they do the following things. First of all, they have to make the food well. You have to honor that culture by making good food. And then secondly, acknowledge where you got it from. And then the third thing, if it's appropriate, you're in a position to do so, then you should compensate the people from whom you got that information. What really irks people is they'll see these stories where someone shows up in someone's culture, they watch them meticulously, right? And then take what they do and do it in another context, and don't hook up the people from who basically taught them how to do that. And so those are my three touchstones. But because here's the opposite. If you buy into that stay in your lane logic, then the opposite conclusion is then me as an African American, I can't make anybody else's food. And I like sushi. I like Southwestern food. I like a lot of different cuisines, and I would love to make that. And, for me, just thinking long term, the only way that African heritage cuisines like soul food and others are going to go worldwide is if people first appreciate them and support them and experience them in restaurants or people's homes. And then secondly, they have to feel comfortable enough to make it in their own home. Think about Mexican food, Italian food, and Chinese food. It's hard to believe, but 50, 75 years ago, those were not popular cuisines because the people associated with that food were stigmatized. And so the fact that today, I don't think anybody would think twice of eating any of those cuisines in the United States shows you that a lot of that process was acceptance from other people and then feeling comfortable, putting their own spin on it or cooking it themselves.
Okay, so you're saying there is absolutely space for us to cook outside of our culture. I mean, I'm 5th generation Asian American, right? So at this point, if I can't cook outside of my culture, what can I cook, right? And in order to do that well and to do it authentically, do our research, right? Make good food, give credit where credit's due. And if we have the opportunity, give back to where we, learn these techniques or these recipes.
Absolutely. That's what I think. Because it's the nature of human beings to look at it, whether, to observe, borrow, adapt. I mean, we're curious beings, right? And so I think, and it's hard to find any cuisine where that hasn't happened. Usually it's been, and sometimes those changes were forced because of conquest, other things. But a lot of times when people come in contact with other people, there's innovation, there's a synergy that develops. There's all kinds of, things that happen. And to me, it's really fascinating to just unpack all of that stuff and say, oh, that's in this part of the world and it shows up over here. I wonder if those are related. What's going on here? Soul food. It's a mix of the West Africa, Western Europe, and the Americas. And I think it's just fascinating to delve into those things.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so Black Smoke. Black Smoke dropped April 27th, so not more than 2.5 weeks ago.
Yes.
And from what I hear and what I see on my social media, people are loving it. You write, though, in your introduction to the book that Black Smoke is important now specifically. Why is it important? So much more important right now? Because
I think more than any time in the history of barbecue, people are making loot. There's so much barbecue prosperity now. And I want African Americans to share in that. For a long time, barbecue was, you would eke out some extra cash. I don't know how many people were making a living. So typically it was somebody, usually dude, who would kill a pig. They're in a rural setting and they would just cook it up. And then, people just knew, hey, stop by Adrian's on Saturday morning and get some whole hog. And then, once that pig runs out, that's it. And then you started to get restaurants. But you didn't have a lot of national chains or anything like that, right? People just had a standalone restaurant and made a living. Now we've got chains. We've got different stratifications of the barbecue market. In barbecue competitions, you can make $50,000 in one weekend. If you do a series of these competitions, you can make $100,000. I mean, Aaron Franklin has shown the way. I mean, by just showing people what he does, he's made millions. And so I think I just want African Americans to get some shine and just sharing that prosperity.
Good. All right. I hear you. I totally hear you. All right, Shannon, let's go to some of our questions. What's our first question? All right. So Chef Sal is asking, what is your favorite barbecue spot in the US that you've been to?
Wow. It's hard to do a short list, but I have to say, just because of the philosophy of the place, Dreamland Barbecue in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. This is the original spot, and this is what I love about that spot. I mean, all that was really on the menu was spare ribs, white bread, and drinks. So when you walked in and sat down, they would just come up to you and ask you, how many do you want? And they were just asking you, how many ribs do you want? So that's my kind of place. Another place that I really liked was LC's in Kansas City, Missouri. Unfortunately, LC died several weeks ago. But it seems like some people are keeping the restaurant going. So I need to go back there and just see, if they've maintained the quality and stuff. But those are the kinds of places I really like.
So you know it's going to be good when they have one menu item. You don't even order, right? They just come up to you and say, how many do you want?
Yeah, because I have a soft spot, and I understand why other businesses do this, but I have a soft spot for businesses that don't try to be all things to all people.
Oh yeah, for sure. Because then you know that they've done their research, it's gonna be good, and it's, you know what I mean? Like they're doing their research and it's gonna be good.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right, let's go with our next question. Is there any history of Native Americans using barbecue pits before the African Americans arrived? I know in the Pacific Northwest, Native Americans used fires for cooking fish and other items.
Great question. So yeah, I actually argue that in my book. So I argue that barbecue is Native American in origin, and what emerges as barbecue later is a hybrid of kind of what Native Americans were doing and then European quick grilling techniques that were fused. So the antecedents were recognizable, but it becomes something a little bit different. But what I argue is that Native Americans were using a shallow pit cooking technique where sometimes they laid the meat right on the wood coals or rocks to cook them. And so the intermediary approach was to essentially create almost like a gridiron, like a grill, using sticks at first and then later with iron. And so that eventually becomes what's known as Southern barbecue. But yeah, there's a lot of evidence of Native Americans using pits. And there were two kinds of pits. I talked about the shallow pit, but there was also an earth oven, which was more of a vertical hole where you would put the fuel source on the bottom, the wood, burn it. And usually there were stones in there because they would retain the heat longer. And then you would do layers of vegetation and meat. And then you'd either cover that up or bury it. And you either started this early in the morning and you ate in the evening, or you started it later in the day and then you would let it cook overnight. And then the next morning you had a breakfast of champions. And we see earth ovens all over the world. The Kalua pig or whatever you call it in Hawaii, the emu in other places. You see that type all over the place. And so I'm arguing that barbecue was the barbecue pits that we understand as Southern barbecue were really just kind of a fusion or a riff off that.
Sure. Definitely an evolution. All right, next question. So Kenji is asking, have you ever cold smoked? If so, what is your favorite type of wood or combination?
I've never cold smoked because I cook on an old school oil drum smoker. So my game is not tight enough to do cold smoking. So I don't have a great answer for you, but when I cook, I love hickory, man. I just love hickory. And I'm using more and more oak, but I just love the perfume and the taste of hickory. Just really love it.
Sarah is asking, who are some of the African-American barbecue chefs that we should be recognizing in the barbecue media? Great question, Sarah.
Yeah, so a lot of people I profile in my book. So just a quick list, I would say Rodney Scott, Charleston, South Carolina, whole hog barbecue guy. He's opening multiple spots across the South. He may go nationwide, so he's definitely one to watch. He just came out with a cookbook called Rodney Scott's World of Barbecue. Dig this. That's the first cookbook by an African-American barbecuer in 3 decades. Now think about all the books on barbecue that come out, and you're saying they couldn't give one African-American book deal. And you're probably saying, oh, well, maybe they didn't pitch or whatever. Look, if you know, on the inside, I'll just tell you, when publishers want a book done, they get it done. And a lot of times publishers will approach someone to write the book. And I actually know personally that a white guy was approached to write the African-American barbecue story. And to his credit, he said, no, I think an African-American should do that. Sylvie Curry, she's on the competition barbecue circuit. If you've ever watched American Barbecue Showdown on Netflix, she's on that show. She goes deep in the competition. I'm not going to give away what happens. And also Ed Mitchell, another whole hog barbecue guy out of North Carolina, older guy, but now his son is helping him out in the business. The Jones sisters, I don't know if you ever watched Queer Eye, but they were featured last season. They're out of Kansas City. And here's the cool thing. They have created a barbecue vending machine. So 24/7, you can get sauce, you can get sandwiches. I know, isn't that tight? So
I want one of those. Can I get one of those?
Yeah. So that's a short list, but there are so many people that could get some shine.
Eric is asking, Adrian, wondering what the response has been from mainstream barbecue media to your books.
I got to say, it's been tremendously good. I'm showing up. Martha Stewart Living did a blurb on my book. Bon Appetit, some other major newspapers are looking at it. Eater.com. So it's been very positive. Which I didn't know if that was going to happen, because I do criticize some of these outlets, because I'm saying that y'all are the problem. And I have to say, it's more of a problem with national press than local. So the closer you get to a community and get to the people, usually the food writers know enough to say, okay, there's some African Americans who are doing this. But the new generation of food writers who are emerging, they're not so great at it. And I can't tell you how many local press headlines I've read where they say, there was never any good barbecue until this white dude showed up and started doing it. And if they would just look at the archives of their own newspaper, they would know that that's not true.
So you're saying super positive across the board right now, right? I'm sure there's always going to be like that negative Nancy person out there who's going to throw a little bit of shade your way. How do you handle that? How do you stay motivated, stay positive to keep moving forward?
So usually I just ignore these people. So check it out. I got some haterade before the book even came out. Some white dude, heard some about what the book's about, just heard about a blurb about it, emailed me saying, well, I don't know what you're going to write, but whatever you're going to write, it's going to be science fiction and fantasy. Here's the history of barbecue you should write. And it was some article that he had that did not mention even African Americans at all. Like African Americans were the helpers. So I usually just ignore him. Now, if somebody has a valid critique, I engage those people, because I'm all about truth. And I think I put together a really good book, but I'm not going to pretend that I have all the answers, because I'm relying on sources. I didn't check everything. I checked a lot of stuff, as you'll see, but I didn't get everything. There may be new evidence that comes to light that puts a different spin on the story. So I'm all about truth, but I feel pretty solid about what I put out. So, and believe it or not, the haterade is coming from unexpected places. Like, there's some African Americans giving me haterade. They're saying I'm not an authentic voice to talk about barbecue because I don't cook in a pit. Even though I cook in an oil drum smoker, that's not good enough. Yeah, whatever. So to answer your question, though, what keeps me motivated is the fact that there's a whole history out there that's been either forgotten or never told. And it just brings me immense joy to discover these stories and to share them with other people.
And we thank you for that. We definitely thank you for that. All right. It looks like John is asking, who was your biggest influence with guiding you on your journey through the culinary world?
Wow. Several people. So there's a woman named Jessica B. Harris. She's really the first one to start writing about the connections between West Africa and food from West Africa and how it shows up in the Americas. So that was very helpful. Toni Tipton Martin, who's written a lot about African-American cooks. I highly encourage you to read her work. John T. Edge, who runs the Southern Foodways Alliance, a very great writer and thinker about Southern food. He's helped me. Another guy named Lolis Eric Eli, who I think has written one of the best books ever on barbecue. It's called Smokestack Lightning. He's been someone I could talk to about a lot of these things. So I really think about them. And then I met him once, but another influence has been Calvin Trillin, because he showed it was possible to write about food with humor And when you read my books, that's one of the biggest surprises for people. People are like, man, I didn't expect this to be funny or entertaining.
It's funny. And I only got like through like 25 pages so far, and it's funny.
Yeah.
So I remember in earlier conversations with you, you mentioned Jessica B. Harris as one of the authors you started reading, right? Which kind of like sparked an interest to start this now 3-book deep journey. And I just saw Jessica B. Harris was one of the reviewers, like early reviewers of your book. Like, what is that like for you?
Oh, it's cool. It's so validating, right? Because, especially when you're someone coming from another field, because look, I'm a lawyer and Politico. So that was my training. So this dude who's been practicing law and then working in the White House decides he wants to come into a field and write about food. There's people like, you shouldn't do that, or, they feel jealous or whatever, territorial. But to have the leading experts in the field say, no, you should pay attention to this dude. He's doing good stuff. That's great. That's just a validating feeling,
Yeah.
So yeah, it felt really good.
Amazing. Well, congratulations on that. Amanda is asking, what is your preference, spicy or sweet barbecue sauce?
I'm a sweet. I like sweet. So growing up in Denver, the strongest influences on our barbecue were Texas and Kansas City. And I just fell in love with Kansas City barbecue. My second favorite is Memphis. So those tend to be sweeter sauces. So I like a thick tomato-based sauce. And my favorite would be commercial sauce is Gates barbecue sauce. They're out of Kansas City. So those are the sauces that I tend to like.
What are your favorite go-to sides to pair with barbecue?
Oh, definitely coleslaw without raisins and potato salad.
So I asked Adrian, hey, you know what? Are there any questions that are off limits? And he was like, no, you can ask me anything. And then he was like, no, I take that back. The one thing you cannot ask me about is coleslaw with raisins. So Adrian, I have to ask you, like, what's your beef with coleslaw and raisins?
It's just sacrilegious, I guess. Who even thought of that? That's like, to me, that's something that would show up on TikTok, right? I'm going to do something crazy. So I'm going to put some raisins in coleslaw. Yeah, I'm just not feeling that.
All right, everyone, you heard it from Adrian Miller. Do not, and I repeat, do not put raisins in your coleslaw.
Oh, no, they can do that. Just don't invite me over and expect me to eat it. You can do whatever you want. I'm not trying to chill people out on that. Just don't expect me to eat it.
All right, you're just going to pass it over.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Meg's asking, how can we find the barbecue places that are only known to locals?
So what I would suggest is, because I don't find the main daily newspapers in communities are really good at this. I would look at the alternative newspapers, like the alternative weeklies and monthlies. Usually the food writers there are pretty good about keeping their pulse on the scene. And if they don't write about it, what I did is, as well as with the major newspapers, I would just write to the restaurant critics and just ask them. So that's one thing. The second thing, look at like Yelp and TripAdvisor, not because you're trusting the reviews that people are writing, but I thought that if a place was commented upon a lot, it was probably a place that I should go to. And then the last thing, believe it or not, if you just put it out on social media, people are happy to give you their opinion. What I would say though is just be as concise and precise as you can, because I have to say reading comprehension skills on social media are not high. Even when I say, hey, I'm looking for a Black-owned place, people will say, oh yeah, here's this in place. It's not Black-owned though. Not what I asked you.
That's funny that you mentioned that, because I was flipping through the back of your book and you do list out by region some really great Black-owned barbecue places to check out. And one of them caught my eye. It was Burns Barbecue in Houston. And I found Burns Barbecue because Siri led me wrong. I used to live in Houston above the 610 loop right off of Shepherd, a couple miles from Burns. And Siri was like, take a left turn. And like, I went down like some random neighborhood and I ran into this Burns Barbecue place when I was trying to just get on Highway 45. So
okay.
Shout out to Burns.
Yeah. Burns is great. It's on my top 20 list. Also, Anthony Bourdain went there. So it was on one of his shows. I don't know if you knew that. But yeah, really good stuff. I love Burns. Houston is a serious eating town, man.
Houston is a good place to eat. I also noticed that there were no Austin barbecue places on that list either.
Yeah, I was focusing on Black-owned, and the one place that I thought about, it's not really a barbecue place, but in Austin, I love Hoover's Home Cooking. But he's kind of like a soul food and barbecue place. But so he only has a few barbecue options on the on the menu. So I thought, well, I don't think I could really put that. And then the other barbecue places, they were solid, but they didn't meet the top 20 criteria.
Top 20. You've done a lot of research.
Yeah, I've eaten in over 200 barbecue joints. That's as far as when I started counting. I've probably eaten in a lot more than that.
Goals. So Chef Susan's asking, have you done research on jerk in Jamaica with the Maroons? How do you think either has had any impact on others' barbecue techniques and flavors?
Yeah, I did look at that because one of the things I wanted to do was to just see, is there an African provenance for barbecue? And certainly the Maroons in Jamaica would be a strong indication of that, because you've got a community directly, people directly from Africa who are isolated. I just could not, the way that jerk is cooked and everything, it doesn't really translate to Southern barbecue. It just seems like it's its own thing. And I was just talking to somebody recently who was exploring those connections. And when he first started, he thought there was a strong connection, and he now no longer thinks that. So I think jerk, I think it's similar, right? Because you're dealing hole in the ground cooking, but the highly seasoned paste and all that kind of stuff, I think is different than what Southern barbecue is. But I did look at that because ultimately I wanted to prove that barbecue was African in origin, because I wanted to do this and say Wakanda forever, right? But barbecue's history is pretty hazy, so it's hard to sort out what was going on. So I didn't close the door completely on that, but somebody's going to have to come along and connect more dots. That's why I still rest on the idea that it's Native American in origin.
For sure. Meg's asking, have you ever considered tracing the history of a food through the United States, or maybe a particular city like you did for the White House staff? I love themes that tie history together.
Oh, absolutely. But I thought about it worldwide. I've been thinking about a concept called global soul. And what I would do is I would take soul food ingredients and just show how it plays out in other cultures. Like black eyed peas show up in a lot of places. So does fried chicken, of course. Chitlins, believe it or not, intestinal eating shows up in a lot of places. Greens, especially mustard greens, sweet potatoes, okra. So yeah, I have thought of hibiscus in terms of it as a drink. So I have thought about that. But it seems like some other people are doing that. So I may be late to the game. Somebody may have scooped me.
It's never too late to join the game. You got to play to win, right?
Well, yeah, but see, what happens in at least African-American spaces, like when you go to these publishers for a book deal, what they do, if there's already one book out, they'll just tell you, oh yeah, there's no need for another one. The field's been covered. And I'm sitting there thinking about how many books every year come out on Italian food, French food, various Asian cuisines. There's always room for those books, but only one book by an African-American on a certain subject. So
how do we change that? Like, how can we, as your friends from coast to coast now, help you in this endeavor?
So the big thing is you just got to support Black writers who are writing about food. So, it costs you nothing to follow somebody on social media, and, you can put them on mute after that. But having a social media following gives you a lot of leverage now, and retweet, share what they post if you like it. The other thing is, purchase products, like purchase books. If you don't want to purchase a book, get your library to do that, because library sales are just as meaningful. So, we just need help amplifying the work, because at some point, regardless of how these publishers and other content providers think, they want to make money. And if they see that there's a market for this work, then they will follow suit. But right now, they just don't see the market, which is ridiculous, because so many Black authors are selling a lot of books, but it's just devalued. And so we have to change their thinking.
Yeah. We do. And we have the power to do that, right? And I think that's why we are hosting these events, to start talking about that and to start figuring out, okay, what are our next steps? How can we help? Yeah. Our next question is, what are the key things that you look for when you go to a barbecue place that tips you off that they're going to be good?
Well, the first thing is you want to smell. It just needs to smell legit, right? And I know people can fake the funk with that. When some people what they're doing is they're cooking one way, but they're starting a small fire with perfume, like hickory and other like heavily scented woods, just to throw you off. But I like places that have a simple menu. Like, again, they're not trying to be all things to all people. They're saying, hey, this is what we're good at. Take a look at it. And then I like the food has to taste good. Those are the touchdowns to me. I can deal with a lot of other stuff. But those are the three things that really, you know, and I want the staff to be inviting. I want to feel like I'm welcome there, and that'll keep me going to a place, you know? So those are things I look for. But in terms of the meat, you know, I like my meat seasoned well. I like it to be tender, but not falling off the bone. That's another thing. Falling off the bone means it's overcooked. So if you think that's a good thing, that's fine. It can still taste good. Just don't say it around me, okay? And then I like sauce. So there's a emerging conventional wisdom that barbecue should be unsauced. That's the influence of these fine dining chefs and these other kind of white dudes who are coming to barbecue now and trying to change the conversation. But most African Americans will tell you that sauce is a barbecuer's calling card. So whenever I hear barbecue should be unsauced, I'm like, says who? So those are things I kind of look for.
I think we have time for one more question. So it looks like Maggie is asking, what are some of your favorite food writers?
Wow. So some of the people I mentioned earlier, you know, I love Tony Tipton Martin's writing, John T. Edge. I like Lolis Eric Eli when he's doing food writing. He's doing less of it now. Calvin Trillin, just because he's just hilarious. Yeah, you know, there's another guy named Michael Twitty. He is an interesting guy, black, gay, and Jewish. And so he writes about a lot of different intersections of the cuisine. He's a great writer. So, you know, I've liked his stuff as well. So those are kind of the people that come to mind.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I think we're running out of time here, but I do want everyone to know where they can find Adrian. I know we didn't get to all of the questions, but I know that, Adrian, if folks reach out to you through your social media channels, I'm sure that you'd be happy to engage there.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, these were great questions. So thank you for being with us.
Yeah, any last thoughts you want to leave us with?
You know, I just gonna say it's a critical moment because there is this barbecue prosperity. So to the extent that, you know, you can amplify Black voices in not only barbecue, but at other aspects of the culinary world, please do so. A lot of times, again, it's no cost. It's very little time on your part. But I want to make something very clear. I am not arguing that barbecue is exclusive to African Americans. I believe that there's room at the cookout for everybody. And so we can come to the table and get to know each other and respect each other and just get our grub on.
Well, Adrian, thank you so much. I certainly know that I learned so much. I see by the comments in the chat box that everyone is just really enjoying this conversation. So everyone, I do encourage you, reach out to Adrian if you have more questions, but please go to the chat box. Thank him for coming and speaking with us today. It was a pleasure as always, Adrian. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time, everyone.